So while we're experiencing climate change the world over, the US has become the world's top oil and gas producer. There are now 17.6 million Americans who live within a mile of an oil and gas well. So how is it that we're moving in the opposite direction towards addressing climate change, when climate change is far from the only ecological crisis we face? We've also released 750,000 new human-made chemicals into our environments. We've tipped the balance of the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle for the use of fertilizer in industrialized agriculture. And we're seeing species loss equivalent to the last major extinction. Indigenous scholars are offering a new approach to thinking about our environmental crises, particularly Carl White, a Potawatomi scholar, who argues that the climate crisis is actually symptomatic of a greater crisis in how we relate to our environments, that comes from seeing our environments as natural resources from which we can freely extract, without recognizing that we indelibly depend upon our environments and that we are related to them intimately. And if we take relationships to be the most fundamental thing in how we relate to our environments, then it becomes important to think about what makes a good relationship, what makes a just relationship. White argues that just relationships are characterized by reciprocity, accountability, trust, and consent. So how are these relationships, or are these relational properties present in our current fossil fuel society? And if not, how can we pivot to begin to design for them? Right now, one of the major focuses of environmental health research has been a concern about a population bomb, that we're just going to have too many people on the planet and we'll outstrip our available resources. But is population growth really the problem? When we look at who's consuming fossil fuels, shown in yellow here, versus who's producing them, a pattern becomes readily apparent. Since 1965, the largest consumers of oil and gas have been the US, Europe, and China, and the producers have been largely in the global south. And because of that, it's those countries that are the leading contributors to greenhouse gases and the leading causes of climate change. The United States has produced almost twice the amount of greenhouse gases than China, its nearest competitor, since the Industrial Revolution. And the US has just 4.25% of the world's population. So it's not the number of people that's the problem, it's overconsumption by a relative few. And returning to the issue of food, 30 to 40% of the US food supply is wasted annually. That's enough food to feed about 2 billion people, and equivalent to about 300 million barrels of oil. So if reciprocity is broken in our current system, how can we begin to design for reciprocity? Thinking at these issues at a global scale makes it very hard to address them. So let's bring it back to the local scale of here in Boston and its relationship with our sister city, Chelsea, whose waterfront is zoned by the state for industrial uses. And based on that zoning, along that creek, the Chelsea Creek, is the majority of the oil that's used in New England stored. There are 7 oil storage facilities in this area, and this provides the heating oil that are used in people's homes and all of the jet fuel for flights in and out of Logan. But those industrial burdens come with risks. Risks like water contamination from those oil storage facilities, which each have permits to discharge waste into the creek. That creek is no longer fishable and swimmable. And when we map what's happening here, we tend to focus on the problem as being in Chelsea. This is a map of those wastewater discharges, and Chelsea is in the 95th percentile nationally for wastewater discharge. But it's not Chelsea that has the problem. It's all of the communities around Chelsea here that are using that oil to heat their homes and to fly from Logan. So how do we start to bring those people who are currently pictured in grey, who are actually depending on and consuming those resources, into the picture? One project my lab is working on in collaboration with Green Roots, an environmental justice organization in Chelsea, is called the Reciprocity Project. And it's a simple idea of building an online quiz that teaches people facts about this city that they might not know they depend on in their daily lives. It asks you things like, since before the pandemic, how much did you fly out of Logan Airport? And then it lets you know that the most frequently trafficked runway from Logan heads straight over Chelsea, and that emits ultrafine particles, which helps increase the rates of asthma in this community. And then it teaches you about the consequences of driving your gasoline-powered car. and who bears the costs of that fossil fuel combustion. If we were to combust all of the oil that's stored along the creek, that would be equivalent to 24 times the entire Massachusetts car fleet driven for a year. And Chelsea is uniquely vulnerable to the sea level rise that's coming about from the climate change because of that combustion. It's estimated that by just 2030, 42% of Chelsea's seafront will be at flood risk. And the quiz calculates for you a debt score for how much you've been drawing on resources, how much you depend on resources from this area. And it invites you to get involved in Green Roots and begin engaging in trying to address some of the environmental injustice in this area. So this kind of tool could be developed for communities across the US and across the globe so we can understand the consequences of our consumption. But of course, this kind of tool depends on the availability of data, which depends on that second relational quality of accountability. And unfortunately, mostly when it comes to thinking about the oil and gas industry, we have pretty poor data. And building on the examples of climate change denial here, I'm just going to describe how the key technology that's driven these two booms in both oil and gas production in the last 20 years in the US is fundamentally unaccountable, and that's hydraulic fracking. And hydraulic fracking is unaccountable because of a law passed in 2005 as part of the Energy Policy Act that's been described as the Halliburton loophole. And this is an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act that means that there will be no federal monitoring of the chemicals used in hydraulic fracking and no disclosure systematically of those chemicals, even though this practice involves injecting millions of gallons of fluid into regions of usable drinking water. And it's called the Halliburton loophole because it was advocated for under the Bush administration by Dick Cheney, who was the former CEO of Halliburton, one of the top oilfield services companies that stood the most to gain from the growth of this practice that has spread across 33 different states. But this isn't just a Republican effort. This is very much a bipartisan effort. And we're seeing, again, the Biden administration calling for, in the face of the Ukraine crisis, the continued construction of liquid natural gas terminals, which will be fed by fracked gas. This is not freedom gas, as Trump has described it, but is in fact further re-entrenching the fossil fuel system that Europe and the US have come to depend on, very frequently based on climate change denial. Let's just take one case of the Venture Global liquid natural gas terminal, which is proposed to be sited in Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana, which currently says that climate change impacts on wetlands are speculative. How can we begin to design for accountability for this system on which we all depend? I teamed up with a group called Healthy Gulf from Louisiana to look at those speculative impacts on wetlands from fossil fuel extractions. These wetlands provide a crucial buffer for our cities from hurricanes and are a key ecosystem. So we organized volunteers online and trained them in how to identify patterns of change in wetlands. And we compared their findings to experts. And what we found with over 1,000 volunteers is that they agree very well with experts. And what both the experts and the participants found, shown in purple here, is that the most frequent patterns of wetlands loss right now are sea level rise and oil and gas extraction. That's because to get to those oil and gas wells, we cut canals through these marshes that stop the marshes from draining properly. And the combination of the marshes flooding from not being able to drain and the sea level rising is causing dramatic land loss. It's estimated up to a football field an hour of land is being lost in this Gulf. And in the wake of Hurricane Ida, we ran another project called Ida Damage Lookout, and we looked specifically at the location proposed for that liquid natural gas terminal in Plaquemines Parish. And you can see here, it's plainly completely flooded following that hurricane. So we can build these kinds of accountability tools. We can develop citizen science projects that let us all see this infrastructure that we depend on. And these can expand to become transnational and reciprocal accountability networks. One of the largest groups of contributors to Land Loss Lookout came from the Niger Delta, from the unique mappers who live in a delta that's also besieged by oil extraction. 13 million tons of oil have been spilled in the Niger Delta. since the inception of the oil industry there. And they asked us to build a project called Land Pollution Lookout, which we released just last week, looking at 360 sites of oil spills in protected wetlands areas. But no amount of accountability technology is going to reverse this damage. And it's impossible to develop an accountability technology when we fundamentally can't know what's happening in our environments. And that's the case currently due to the Halliburton loophole around hydraulic fracking. Based on the competition between oil services companies like Halliburton and Schlumberger, who don't want to release their proprietary compounds for fracking, 7.7 billion pounds of proprietary chemicals have been used since 2011 across the US in hydraulic fracking. And based on that, informed consent is presently impossible around this industry. Neither a landowner nor the government knows what's being injected into our subsurface and consequently affecting our waters. So if we're truly going to create accountability and begin to unsettle this industry that we all depend on, we're going to need to think differently about how humans interact with their environments and begin to really think about collaboration instead of competition. After all, it's the competition between these oilfield services companies that have created these fundamental knowledge gaps around fracking. And again, here we can turn to some of the amazing work coming from indigenous communities in thinking about collaboration as a key form of our ecological systems. And one amazing example of that is Three Sisters agriculture. It's the growing of corns, bean, and squash together because of the complementary relationship between these plants. The corn sister grows up first and it provides a scaffold for the bean to grow around. And it might seem at first that the bean is taking advantage of the corn, but if you look beneath the subsurface, it's actually fixing nitrogen and enriching the soil for both plants. Meanwhile, the squash sister grows last, spreading across the ground and unfurling these great big leaves that shade out other competing plants and helps water retention in that soil. And this was a predominant form of agriculture in the US prior to settlement, but settlers really didn't understand the complexity of this system, nor did they understand the extraordinary human health benefits of eating these three plants together. When corns, bean, and squash are eaten together, it forms a complete protein, virtually eliminating the need for meat in a diet. When that corn is nixtamalized, which means it's treated with an alkaline solution, calcium is made more available, and that also replaces the need for milk in a diet. And this was a foundation of the very healthy cultures pre-settlement in the US. Right now, we are still very much a corn culture, but we don't grow corn with beans and squash. We put a huge amount of effort into growing corn as a monoculture. We dedicate the land surface of California right now to growing corn. And growing corn in isolation like that requires immense inputs of fertilizer. About 10 million tons of fertilizer are used annually on that corn crop. And that fertilizer is derived from natural gas. The making of that fertilizer has its own enormous carbon footprint, about the size of the city of Indianapolis. And making that fertilizer produces a radioactive toxic waste that we currently really don't know what to do with and store in large open-air pits in Louisiana, creating a huge environmental injustice issue there. And that fertilizer doesn't stay put. It travels off our fields, down our rivers and streams, and particularly down the Mississippi, where it increases the nutrient load in the Gulf of Mexico that we were just looking at, helping to produce a massive dead zone annually. In 2019, that dead zone was over 6,000 miles wide. But if we were actually growing corn with beans, we might be able to eliminate 40 to 100% of that fertilizer. And moreover, the enriched corn actually improves the yield from both of those crops by about 30%. So you could actually grow more food on a smaller amount of space. And it's not just fertilizer we treat those crops with. To grow them as monocultures and prevent other pest species from eating them, we apply millions of tons of synthetic herbicides, fungicides, and pesticides. 64 different pesticides are used on squash alone. The most commonly used herbicide on corn is atrazine. This map shows the spread of atrazine that we apply across the country. This is an endocrine disruptor, and at very low doses it can change the sex ratio of amphibian species and is contributing to the massive species decline we're seeing in frogs. But if we were to grow these three plants together, it creates a much more complicated ecosystem where predators for those pests could also live. Allelopathy occurs where the pumpkins produce their own chemicals that help dissuade other plants from growing, and they just frankly shade out other competing plants. So we might be able to reduce that demand for those chemical inputs. And beneath the surface, there's a much more complicated root system as these three plants grow together. And what this means is during severe weather events like Hurricane Ike in Cuba, the polycultures lost 50% of their mass, whereas monocultures lost 90 to 100%, and the polycultures recovered faster. And this is, of course, becoming even more important in the context of climate change, where we're seeing increasingly severe hurricanes and flooding. These maps show the flooding in the Missouri River in 2019, which was one of the worst cases of flooding in the state's history and caused $400 million worth of damage. So if we were to think about reuniting the three sisters, we could reduce or eliminate that fertilizer use. That would reduce fossil fuel demand. That would reduce the carbon footprint. It would reduce hazardous waste production. It would also help reduce and eliminate the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides. It would reduce environmental injustice. It would reduce nitrogen and phosphorus production and runoff. It could improve yields while reducing the amount of land we dedicate to crops and reduce dead zones and biodiversity loss. The question really is, are settler societies able yet to see the benefit of these kinds of complementary relationships and begin actively designing now to support ethical, social, and environmental relationships? I argue this is possible, and we can begin to do it by designing for reciprocity, accountability, consent, and trust. And of course, none of this work was achieved without an enormous network of collaborators, and this is just a tribute to all of the people who have helped make this work possible. Thank you so much for your time.